Hello, and welcome to Academic Perspectives on Conspiracism, a podcast about the research that's being done on the place of conspiracy theories in society, culture, and politics. Each episode is a conversation with an academic about their research on a different aspect of conspiracism. I'm Adam Cope, a postdoctoral fellow with the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data here at Cardiff University. In this episode, we'll be talking about how conspiracy theories and narratives about conspiracy theories can be weaponized to shape how we view and understand a conflict. I'll be talking with Dr. Margaret Gamberton, co-ordinator of the Narrative Warfare Research Network, whose PhD thesis was on the narrative war surrounding military interventions in Côte d'Ivoire. Margaret is a fellow alumnus of the University of York, and we met while we were both doing our PhDs at the same time at the politics department there. Her thesis has since been published as a book titled Waging Peace, The Narrative War for Côte d'Ivoire, and I highly recommend checking it out. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here today, talking about one of my favorite topics.
Great to have you here. So this episode we'll be talking about Côte d'Ivoire as a case study of a narrative war. Could you just give us some background on the conflict itself and the international interventions that happened in Côte d'Ivoire?
Sure. Côte d'Ivoire is a small but important West African country which lies nestled into the curving coastline below the large bulging shoulder of West Africa. And I position it because I assume everyone in the world knows where Côte d'Ivoire is, and that's a poor assumption. The state of Côte d'Ivoire was founded as an independent nation in August 1960 after 100 years as a French colony. Unlike many former colonies, the transition to statehood was relatively smooth thanks to the foundational leader, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who prioritized maintaining good relationships with France. Côte d'Ivoire went through a long period, 40 years, of relative peace and prosperity under the single-party, charismatic, authoritarian rule of the president for life, Houphouët-Boigny, until he died in 1992. So in my research, I described the 25 years of conflict after Houphouët-Boigny's death. Sometimes that's called the Ivoirian Long War. And it took place up until, say, 2017, 1992 to 2017. My specific focus is on the two Ivoirian civil wars. The first Ivoirian civil war was fought between 2000 and 2007. And the second Ivoirian civil war took place over 5 months between December 2010 and April 2011. And in my research, I analyzed the strategic narratives that were used between 2002 and 2017, the 15 years of intervention, which took place in Côte d'Ivoire from the beginning of their first civil war to past the conclusion of their second. The Ivoirian Long War was essentially a war of succession and a civil war of conquest between northern Ivoirian elites, who were headed by the ex-prime minister Alassane Ouattara, and the southern elites, who were championed by then-president and socialist firebrand Laurent Gbagbo. Long story short, Ouattara engaged French and UN support in a civil war against Gbagbo. And Gbagbo, for many years, enjoyed more indigenous Ivoirian support and had a long holding action, managed to stay in power longer than anybody thought he would, 10 years almost. The second Ivoirian Civil War of 2010 to 2011 was resolved the political stalemate that had happened for 8 years through combat. The second Ivoirian Civil War was won by guns and ammo and bombs and helicopters. The French and the UN engaged in combat with and for Alassane Ouattara and his northern elites, and they defeated the then president Laurent Gbagbo in spite of pretty widespread southern Ivoirian support. This is an important conflict from a political science point of view, particularly peace studies, because for the first time, the UN directly engaged in combat, partisan combat, during a peacekeeping mission. And they declared this, the UN, the French, the West, in air quotes, a successful peacekeeping intervention. And that's also unusual. There's a lot of research on failed peacekeeping interventions There aren't many that the UN and the international community have labeled as successes. Côte d'Ivoire was presented as simply a success, unalloyed, non-problematic, win for the good guys,
Right.
which is where I came into the analysis, because at that time I was working for the US Department of Defense, and I knew absolutely we were the good guys. But I just wanted to know, how did we know what was going on in Côte d'Ivoire? I was interested in the epistemology of combat. In the fog of war, how do you know what's happening? And that's how I came to do a PhD at the University of York.
Right. So your specific approach, it's strategic narrative analysis, right?
Okay, so in my research, I combined two schools of political communication analysis and merged them into a theoretical framework, and I'll explain that a little bit. The first school of political communication analysis is strategic narrative analysis. And that is essentially a British endeavor, although there are people around the world who know about it. It started in 2010 with academic Professor Andreas Antoniades and Professors Ben O'Loughlin and Alasdair Maskimon wrote a very influential paper in 2010. And then from 2014 onwards, O'Loughlin, Maskimon, and another academic, Laura Roselle, essentially founded a school of international political communication analysis called strategic narrative analysis. So their seminal works are Strategic Narratives, Communication and Power, and the New World Order. And the second book is Forging the World, Strategic Narratives and International Relations. And these are very influential works. This is a school of political communications analysis, which examines and theorizes the role of international political communications at the international and state nexus. In other words, it's focused on where states cooperate, collaborate, fight, go to war at an international level.
Right.
So the analysis focuses on strategic narratives. Strategic narratives they place at that nexus. These are the narratives that national and international actors use to compete for outcomes. I think the word strategic also means high-level goals. So these are the important ones to get what we really want to do, the purpose of what we're trying to achieve. It may also come from the times in which we use strategic to refer to nuclear. So the most important of the important, life and death narratives. But it's a specific level of structural analysis. And the SNA provides a structured theoretical framework to approach empirical analysis of the role and impact of these communications. It integrates both analysis of the traditional forms of state international communications, diplomatic, formal, state-based, and the new communications technologies and the realities of the 21st century at an international level. So our technologies have created new opportunities and new problems in international communication. International actors can bypass other international actors and speak directly to their populations in ways that were never technologically possible before. I also worked with a body of theory called narrative analysis, NA. This is based in the United States. There's a think do tank in Washington called narrative strategies. And these folks have a different form of strategic narrative analysis. I've combined both of these schools of analysis in my work because I feel that we need to link up and understand the ways in which the two different frameworks can together be more powerful and explanatory. I know you're interested in how this analysis differs from other approaches to understanding conspiracy narratives and conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Did you have any questions about strategic narrative analysis and narrative strategies first?
I'm just interested for you to say a bit more about the unique contribution that this kind of approach can bring.
So where's the so what? The so what is that these approaches differ substantially from what I consider the mainstream efforts right now in conspiracy theory analysis. And I will characterize that as the disinformation wars approach.
Right, yeah.
Strategic narrative analysis is systemic, meaning it's systems oriented. It's non-normative, and it's empirical. So it looks at communications narratives as data in a conflict. And a conflict has to have, at a minimum, two sides. It analyzes the content, production process, and impact, assuming that the conflict is at the minimum a mutual contest for power. Now, we know a lot of contests have more than two actors, but they've always got at least two actors, or else it's not a conflict. It's not a conflict. It's something else, but it ain't a conflict. In the SNA model, conspiracy narratives are one type of political communication in a contest for power. It's dyadic, it's non-normative, and disinformation warfare theoretical model is much more popular. It's much more common. There are a lot more people doing it, but it is monadic. That means the analysis focuses on the adversary only, and it's normative. It's about how bad the bad guys are and all the bad things they are doing to us. But it doesn't talk about what we're doing to them. So the disarm framework, which is on the web, people can consult Dr. Google under disarm framework. It's an exemplar. Within disarm, disinformation analysts focus on conspiracy narratives in terms of what's said, who says it, why it's wrong, and why the narratives should be rejected or blocked, and what harm they're doing to us. It assumes, the disarm framework and standard disinformation or conspiracy narrative analysis assumes that conspiracies, theories, conspiracy narratives are exogenous. They're not part of us. They're something that bad people do to us, that they are purposive, and that it's done by malicious actors to innocents. So it is the standard disinformation war model of conspiracy analysis, politically positional. It's practitioner rather than theory oriented. It's not really about understanding conspiracies. It's about fighting conspiracies and fighting with them. It is normative. It presumes a one-sided attack from a malicious adversary, and that adversary is seeking unethical gains. It focuses more on the product, the narrative, and a unilateral production process, how they're doing it to us. Right. Functionally, what this means is that disinformation wars conspiracy theory analysts, and that's a mouthful, they're players, they're not commentators. Disinformation warfare analysis of conspiracy theories is not produced to understand the world. It's produced to influence and shape the world. In other words, disinformation analysis is part of a narrative war. It's not an analysis of that narrative war. So they're players, not commentators. I've had people say that it looks to them like propaganda. And that's what it is. It is propaganda. But I'm taking a non-normative stance. I'm not saying propaganda is bad. I'm just saying it is. It's what could be, in less normative terms, called influence. Disinformation analysts are attempting to influence what their readers believe and influence what other people believe. In contrast, in the work I do, I'm just trying to figure out what the heck's going on. Right. I'm not trying, believe me or not, I'm not interested in fighting the war, and I'm not interested in how truthful or malicious or inaccurate or real or right the conspiracy theories that I'm analyzing are. I'm more interested in what role do they play in this war? Why do people believe them? I mean, people believe really, really outrageous things, and I can have a theory that they're all just stupid boobs, or I can ask myself, why do people believe these things that I don't believe?
Just to follow up on that slightly, with the whole disinformation analysis approach, is that the sort of thing that we see a lot with the discourse around, say, Russian intervention or Russian influence in American presidential elections? Is that the sort of place where you see disinformation analysis being used?
Yes, the purpose is to, if I was a disinformation warrior, I would say that my purpose would be to educate, to help people understand what's going on. And that is true, and it's perfectly legitimate. That's their purpose. You need to understand that the purpose is to influence. I'm not trying to persuade anybody that their beliefs are wrong. I'm much more interested in why they believe them rather than whether they're right or wrong. So you'll notice that, I mean, honestly, we could bury ourselves and smother in the amount of paper being produced currently on Russian disinformation campaigns. There is an astounding lack of interest in what the West is doing
Right.
in that literature. So for me, that is an incomplete and not particularly, that's not my problem set. It's certainly fine work for other people who want to do it. I'm just not those folks.
Right. And so you're sort of more focused with how these conspiracy theories are used.
Well, why people believe them. In strategic narrative analysis and in narrative strategies analysis, it's more of a theory. It's more of trying to understand how the world works. If you have something that is an outrageous belief, why do people believe it? What is it about that narrative, which to all intents and purposes looks like nonsense? Why would people who we assume have some level of rationality, some level of intelligence, why do they believe this gobbledygook? So it's the why do they believe? And it's also, we take an analytic step back and assume that we do not have a monopoly on the truth. To wage disinformation warfare analysis, you have to assume you already know everything that's true and everything that's not true. And it assumes that the war is fought on the grounds of facticity, of accuracy, of truthiness. That's not where wars are fought. They're fought on the grounds of meaning, belief, identity, values. And that's why my personal belief is that understanding narrative wars, understanding disinformation wars is at least as important as fighting them. So it's like a bit like cancer. You know, you can fight cancer or you can study cancer. But when you try and fight it and study it at the same time, you're going to become very muddled. So we have, with 8 billion people on the planet, we can afford to specialize.
That's something I find really valuable about your sort of approach, is that ability to step back from the noise, because, you know, in the last few years, we've had so much just in public discourse, popular fears about, you know, what influence the conspiracy theories having on our politics, people trying to debunk conspiracy theories or debunking, say, what Donald Trump has said. But in a sense, that's kind of missing the point. And like you were saying, missing the struggle over meaning and things like belonging as well that's going on there. I just want to move on to my next question, which is, what role do conspiracy narratives or conspiracy theories have in conflict? What role did they specifically have in Côte d'Ivoire?
Côte d'Ivoire was an interesting case study for me. In Côte d'Ivoire, I'd like to use this example to introduce a few more terms of jargon. They had both exogenous and endogenous uses, and exogenous conspiracy theories are conspiracy narratives that are produced and used by external narrative entrepreneurs, political actors outside of a group who create conspiracy theories, conspiracy narratives to foment and intensify conflict, polarization, and distrust. We could also call it to help people be brave and to resist the oppressor. But the point is, they come from outside. They're not internally generated within a group by the group to make sense of their own situation. So we have lots and lots of endogenous conspiracy theories. In fact, I think conspiracy theories decades ago were primarily endogenous. They were stories about political plots that people created to try and make sense of the political realities that they lived and observed in their worlds. But in the 21st century, exogenous conspiracy theories are really important. The idea is that actors such as Russians make up conspiracies on people such as Democrats, and then they inject them through social media into a population and essentially contaminate their thinking. And I absolutely understand that that happens. I understand that it's legitimate to be a practitioner combating that. But what I want to do is get up off the board and look at how the game is played. So endogenous conspiracy theories took part in, or played an important role in the Ivorian experience of their civil war. There were many, many endogenous Ivorian conspiracy theories. A very important endogenous conspiracy theory was the belief that or the narrative, that Alassane Ouattara was not actually Ivoirian. When I say he wasn't actually Ivoirian, he wasn't Ivoirian by the definition of the Ivoirian constitution, that he would have to be Ivoirian in this particular way in order to be a legitimate candidate for president. And this endogenous conspiracy theory is in some ways startlingly similar to Obama's birther conspiracy theory. People believe this person is not entitled to run for president, not entitled to be president because of the circumstances of their birth, nationality, identity. And there's no reason to believe that that was not an endogenous conspiracy theory. That is, it was believed by a substantial portion of the Ivoirian population. Ivoirians also believed that there was a conspiracy between Ouattara and the French presidency, the French state, to shoehorn Ouattara into the presidency of Côte d'Ivoire and to keep him there. And since that is what in fact happened, it's not a completely unreasonable belief. This conspiracy theory, this conspiracy narrative, caused problems for the French because it problematized their position as benign hegemons. It made it look like their intervention in Côte d'Ivoire was to further their own political interests, including their extractive interests in Côte d'Ivoire as a neo-colony. So the French, and by extension later the UN, needed to counter this conspiracy narrative, and they did so by labeling it a conspiracy theory. And the French and the UN later claimed that indigenous Ivoirian elites created this conspiracy theory for their political advantage. And by labeling it a conspiracy theory, the French were at the minimum, and the UN were at the minimum, able to delegitimize this narrative to some extent in the international community. And the delegitimization of this conspiracy narrative was really important because the international community, the diplomatic corps of the United Nations, for the first time ever authorized combat, direct partisan combat in 2011. So this was an important strategy to delegitimize Ivoirian concerns about Alassane Ouattara's legitimacy and his French backing. Now, please note, I am not by any means extending this to Barack Obama. I'm just saying conspiracy narratives often have interesting parallels across cultures. We see patterns that repeat. It doesn't mean they're true or false. It just means there's something about these narratives that works for people or doesn't work for them. So that would be an example of an endogenous conspiracy narrative, which was then labeled as a conspiracy theory by exogenous actors and was used to delegitimate a particular narrative. One thing that's different about my work is that I like to look at the powerful as well as the less powerful. So one of the interesting findings in my research was realizing that what can be called the genocide narrative, the story that Côte d'Ivoire in its civil wars was on the brink of genocide, that Ivoirian elites were conspiring to commit genocide against the North and Northern politicians, was actually a conspiracy theory. I mean, wait a minute, aren't conspiracy theories only stories that crazy people believe? No, conspiracy theories are, or conspiracy narratives, are stories about political actors conspiring together to perpetrate bad acts, basically. So the French and United Nations narrative that the Southern Ivoirian elites were on the verge of creating or prosecuting a genocide against the Northern Ivoirians actually fits our definition of conspiracy theory. And it was used to great impact. I would say that that was the single most important narrative in convincing the international community that it had to take military action against the Ivoirian presidency and government was to prevent a genocide in the North. And that is actually an admirable thing. We don't want genocide. Nobody wants genocide. Unfortunately, history proved us wrong because the only evidence of anything approaching genocide in the Ivoirian civil wars was that in the Second Civil War, during combat, the level of slaughter of the North by the South and the dispossession of the South by the North was the only thing even marginally approaching genocide. Now, I don't think it actually counts as genocide, but the historical record afterwards should really demand that we have to examine genocide narratives very, very carefully for their weaponized deployment in any conflict.
I guess that using the term genocide makes it such a high stakes situation that you need to kind of be sure that the narrative is right. One thing that we should clarify is that when you're doing your research, are you interviewing people? Are you reading texts? Where are the narratives that you're collecting?
Okay, fair question. I'm a little bit crazy when it comes to data. So I had two primary types of data. Well, I'll call it three. The first primary corpus that I used were the UN news articles, reports, and documents on the Ivorian conflict. I had 1,500 news articles taken from the web and stored from 2002 to 2017. That's my corpus, roughly 1,500 news articles. I had about 200 reports of various types. And I had roughly 800 other written sources, many of them Ivoirian, on the conflict. So first set of data, UN online documentation. Second set of data, both academic and gray literature on the conflict, about 800 documents. Third set of data, fieldwork and interviews in Côte d'Ivoire.
Wow, that sounds like a lot.
It is.
One word that comes up a lot in the book is counter-hegemonic, and that conspiracy narratives, at least sometimes, can be counter-hegemonic. Could you explain what the word counter-hegemonic means?
Okay, well, the one thing I have to make, one point I really need to make clear, is when I'm using the terms hegemonic and counter-hegemonic, I'm using them non-normatively.
Right.
It's really important to be clear on this point because in some discourses, hegemonic is by definition bad, and counter-hegemonic is by definition good. And I do not share those definitions, and I don't use them. Hegemonic, as I use it in the analysis in Côte d'Ivoire, means powerful, and counter-hegemonic is less powerful. Hegemonic is the consensus, the common sense, the everyday or right thinking of the majority. And there are plenty of times that the hegemonic worldview is right. I personally plan never to walk out of a fifth-story window because I believe the hegemonic consensus, the common sense belief, that's a bad idea. The counter-hegemonic is resistance to a powerful actor by less powerful, and therefore, by definition, it's relational. In this particular relationship, the international community, France, the United Nations, the global North are hegemonic. And I think beyond any shadow of a doubt, they are more economically, politically, technologically, and militarily powerful than the Ivoirian state. So I set up a dialectic between the powerful actors and the less powerful. That's my level of analysis, the state and international nexus, where the state meets the international. If I, for example, was doing an analysis of purely Ivoirian internal politics, the terms would change completely because those relationships are very different. A counter-hegemonic Ivoirian president confronting and defying the international system is a very different type of political actor than that same president within his country, given the powers of his presidency. So in my particular set of research, hegemonic refers to the more powerful international actors, primarily the French and the UN, And I'm using hegemonic also in the sense of the everyday, the common sense, the right thinking. Counter-hegemonic refers to the Ivoirian national political actors who were part of the Gbagbo regime. Laurent Gbagbo himself, the political actors who supported him, the Ivoirian citizens who supported him. And they are counter-hegemonic in that they were opposing the power of the very powerful international actors who were opposed to Laurent Gbagbo and his government. One thing to emphasize about hegemonic and counter-hegemonic. When I first went to Côte d'Ivoire, I was taking a language class, and it was a very interesting class and had many very interesting people in it. And they said, the one thing you have to understand about Côte d'Ivoire is there are no good guys here. And, you know, I found out they were right. But I would clarify that to say there's plenty of good and plenty of evil to go around on both sides. Okay, so does that clarify what I mean by the terms hegemonic and counter-hegemonic in Côte d'Ivoire in the context of the Ivoirian conflict?
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of like you were saying, relational. I suppose it's to do with power, and also like you clarified, that the level at which you're looking at is also really important. And that brings me on to my last question, which is kind of related to this. What does it mean for the term conspiracy theory to be used as a counter-narrative strategy?
A counter-narrative strategy. Well, could I first say what it means for a conspiracy narrative to be counter-hegemonic?
Yeah.
Okay. Conspiracy theories are stories, generally speaking, in our common usage about elites, which are held by non-elites and are considered a form of resistance, criticism, a critique of elites and the sources of structural violence and inequality in any given society. A clear example of a counter-hegemonic conspiracy narrative is the Togolese conspiracy narrative that their rulers are literally vampires. They mean with teeth and necks. They believe it. We would translate that to say that the Togolese elites are literally extractive. And in the West, we use the term extractive elites, although we don't usually talk about fangs and necks.
Right.
This is really not very far away from QAnon's conspiracy theories of cannibalistic democratic leadership sacrificing and consuming the adrenochrome of infants. It's pretty much the same story. So often the conspiracy narratives that we label conspiracy theories are counter-hegemonic in that they are non-elites telling stories which are produced, replicated, disseminated to persuade themselves and others to resist the ruling political class. So counter-hegemonic conspiracy theories are the norm to oppose the powerful. And they're the bread and butter for people like you and me who analyze conspiracy narratives. But what tends to be overlooked or neglected is the hegemonic uses of the conspiracy narratives. As I was talking about with the conspiracy narrative incipient genocide by the Ivoirian South, that was a hegemonic conspiracy narrative. So to go on to your question about what does it mean for a conspiracy theory to be used as a counter-narrative strategy? A narrative is a story about something. Counter-narrative strategy means a way to dispute or discredit a powerful narrative. In general, in narrative theory, across the board, people know at this point, counter-narratives, they just don't work. I can tell you until the cows come home that there are no vampires in Togo, or that Democrats don't suck adrenochrome, but it won't work. It just isn't an effective strategy because the story is not really about fangs or blood or adrenochrome. The story, conspiracy theory, is really about their sense of oppression, their identities as a member of the underclass. The extraction, which is metaphorically represented in conspiracy narratives, is very real to people, whether it is carried out by fangs and sacrifice or taxation and structural violence. So to use a conspiracy theory as a counter-narrative strategy means to call something a conspiracy theory, to dispute a contested narrative, to discredit it, to frame it as a belief only held by crazy, uneducated people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I guess that kind of, again, like it's sort of It's always one of the difficult things of working in this field is that you have to stress again that we're not saying that anything about the actual truth claims that are being made in those narratives, that it's like you were saying, that we're kind of almost studying how the game is being played.
But Adam, if you were a disinformation warrior, you would be making truth claims. The
Oh,
difference
yeah.
between what we do and what disinformation warriors do is we want to talk about how it's done. They
Yeah.
want to dispute the truth claims. I think there's a time and a place and a role, and that it's a legitimate act. I couldn't have worked for the Department of Defense as long as I did if I did not believe that in some times and places conflict is necessary and inevitable. But because this is such an important part of our current conflicts, I want to get off the board, and I invite other people who are interested in conspiracy theories to get up off the board with me and to have a look at how the game is played.
Right. You've used this sort of approach so far to look at Côte d'Ivoire. Do you have any future research projects coming up?
I have an ongoing research project, which is even more hopelessly complicated and data intensive. I'm looking at how the Ukrainian war is reported in the UK and in the United States. I'm looking at the strategic narratives, how they're produced, how they're replicated, how they are the same and how they're different. And the comparative analysis is very, very interesting in this case because there are important structural similarities, but where we really see the interesting things is where they're different.
Is that a book or another
That's
book
a
or an
book.
article?
It's a book.
Do you have like an estimate of when that will be out and available for people
Oh
to?
yeah. As soon as the Ukrainian conflict wraps up.
Oh, no. It might be some time then. Well, thank you for speaking with me. This has been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot about Côte d'Ivoire and its politics. Thank you very much. So we're at the end of another episode. Thanks to Margaret Gamberton again for speaking with me about her really fascinating research on the Côte d'Ivoire and the conspiracy theories that sprung up in relation to that conflict. Our soundtrack is Spy Music by Echo Cinematics, and I'll see you for our final episode next time.